have some new CNN reporting on Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon. Israel has suggested that it had to act fast because Tehran was quickly approaching a point of no return in its nuclear weapons program. But sources tell CNN that U.S. intelligence assessments concluded something very different. That Iran was not actively pursuing a nuclear weapon and was at least 3 years away. And this morning, the president is weighing in on this. So let's go live now to CNN White House reporter Elena Treen. Elena, walk us through this new back and forth on Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Yeah, well, there seems to be some daylight, Pamela, between what the U.S. intelligence community is saying regarding how far off Iran is from developing a usable nuclear weapon and what Israel is saying really to justify some of the attacks that we've seen them make toward Iran. Now, the president was pressed about this when he was flying back from Canada this morning back to Washington. And he was asked specifically about what his own director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, testified to in March, which is essentially that they were still far off from creating a viable nuclear weapon. Take a listen to what he told reporters.
How close do you personally think that they were to getting one? Because Tulsi Gabbard testified in March that the intelligence community said Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon.
I don't care what she said. I think they were very close to having it.
So pretty dismissive there when asked by our own CNN, Caitlin Collins, about this. I want you to take a listen, though, to what exactly Gabbard had said back in March. Listen.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is at its highest levels and is unprecedented for a state without nuclear weapons.
So, Pamela, the reason that this is so important, of course, is because it shows that the president seems to be more in line right now with what we are hearing from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, using that to really justify these different missiles that they are launching toward Iran. I should say these unprecedented strikes that we have seen. Much more, hopefully, that we can learn today from what the president is doing behind closed doors, particularly in that upcoming meeting with his National Security Council in the Situation Room.
U.S. intelligence says, or certainly said in March, that that Iran was years away from racing towards a bomb. Take a listen to my colleague Zach Cohen reporting earlier.
Yeah, there appears to be some daylight between what the U.S. intelligence community sees as far as how far away Iran is from developing a usable nuclear weapon and what Israel has said in the aftermath of those most recent airstrikes, which it is justified by saying there is an urgent threat posed by Iran's nuclear weapons program. And look, we're hearing from our sources that the U.S. intelligence community assessed prior to those Israeli strikes that Iran was not actively working towards a nuclear weapon. And what's more is if they had decided to do so, it would take up to 3 years before they were able to develop not only a nuclear bomb, but the delivery system that would be used to launch it toward a target of its choosing. And so that's a pretty extended timeline, especially when you compare it to the public statements made by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders who have really framed Iran's nuclear program as an urgent threat. And again, saying that these strikes were needed to preempt that coming to fruition. And look, Donald Trump's director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, testified back in March that Iran was not actively working towards a nuclear weapon. And she said that the U.S. intelligence community continued to assess that Iran was staying at the levels consistent under the threshold as dictated by the JCPOA. But take a listen to what Donald Trump said when he was asked earlier today about Gabbard's testimony from March.
How close do you personally think that they were to getting one? Because Tulsi Gabbard testified in March that the intelligence community said Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon.
I don't care what she said. I think they were very close to having it.
Ali, what do you make of this?
It's stunning, Becky, that we have gone from manufacturing intelligence to go into wars in the Middle East to now ignoring intelligence in order to engage in wars in the Middle East. The reality is we knew that Iran, as a result of President Trump's decision to come out of the nuclear agreement in 2018, at Prime Minister Netanyahu's urging, Iran had made nuclear advancements, and it would take Iran less than a week to enrich enough fissile material for a single nuclear weapon. But that is not a nuclear weapon. That is.
All right, Ali, let me
still
just
requires
jump
to be
in because we
manufactured.
are hearing sirens over Tel Aviv in Israel again. Let me just jump in for a moment. 17 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, 5 days after Israel's initial attacks on Iran, early morning attacks, local time, on Iran. As we work to get my colleague Nick Robertson up live for you in Tel Aviv. Ali, apologies for jumping in there. As we sit on these images, and it's important to sort of work out what is going on there over Israel. In a recent article for Time, you wrote, and I quote you here, "The question may be less a matter of whether diplomacy can succeed in all of this than how grievously the situation could escalate." You wrote, "The worst case scenarios are dire. A cycle of Israeli and Iranian counterstrikes that draw in the US, Iran's non-state allies, for what they're worth these days, and regional states." There is, of course, this, this narrative that says regime change at this point in Iran, and what that means going forward, what that looks like going forward. How do you see this conflict developing from here?
Well, look, we're climbing up the escalation ladder for sure. In terms of the conflict is expanding in terms of the type of targets that both sides are going to go after. It started with military nuclear sites, leadership sites in Iran, but is now expanding to infrastructure and energy sector as well. And eventually, if Iran retaliates in kind, I think it will create the kind of rattling of energy markets that could drag in the United States. Or if Iran continues to escalate its attacks on residential areas in Israel, eventually there will be American casualties as well. And that could drag the United States in, even if the president today decides that he's still going to give one last chance to diplomacy. So the more this continues and expands and escalates, the higher the risk that it turns into a fully fledged regional conflagration, which basically will have no winners.
Briefly, let me ask you, very specifically, what are you watching for next?
Look, at this moment, I think the most important question is what the United States would decide to do, is whether it decides to end this conflict or join it. That would really determine the fate of the region and U.S. policy in the region. I think there is still a chance for a diplomatic solution, but that requires President Trump to create distance from Israel and basically hold both Israel and Iran back in order to be able to get Iran back to the negotiating table. But he does not seem to be moving in that direction.
Question is, will the US, Stephen, decide to end this conflict or get involved in this conflict? Let's just briefly speak to who it is who surrounds the US president at this point. Ultimately, his responsibility as commander-in-chief is to make the decision. Who's whispering in his ear at this point?
Well, you have a pretty inexperienced team. You have Pete Hegseth, a former Fox News anchor who's the Secretary of Defense. In the past, you've seen people like Robert Gates or Leon Panetta in presidential cabinets with years of national security experience. You've got Marco Rubio, who was careful after this all broke out to say, look, this wasn't the United States' war. This was started by Israel, that the US wasn't involved. He has been very deferential to Trump because he wants to have a future political career. But historically, he's been on the far more hawkish side of things. The vice president, J.D. Vance, is potentially the most isolationist member of this administration, and I think any recent U.S. political administration. He, I think, could well be seen to be counseling against deeper involvement as a representative of the real grassroots of the Trump movement. Yet he again is also wanting to have a future political career and has his eyes on the Oval Office. So you have lots of competing things here. I think to the point that was just made is, as well as does the US want to end it or join it, does the president have the capacity and the bandwidth to do it? Is he willing to put pressure on Israel if he decides that there's going to be a diplomatic solution here? Is he willing to fully commit to military action? I think there's a lot we don't know about Trump, and the hard decisions that he's faced with here almost all go against his instincts.